Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Let's Think About That. Today we have the illustrious Tony Trull, Ben and my father, joining us today for a reprise on our subject of sci-fi. Ben and I both enjoyed discussing Dune so much that we decided to take another dip into the sci-fi waters, and this time kind of turn back to an earlier era when sci-fi, I think, kind of really got going in the 60s and 70s. I would think we could talk about that, whether that's really when it got going or not. And Ben and I both got into sci-fi originally by picking through the buckets or tubs, rather, of old sci-fi magazines that our dad had collected, and mostly became enraptured by the pretty darn good cover art, I would say, on those old school magazines. And then later, as our reading ability increased, actually some of the stories, although a lot of it was kind of pulp garbage that was fun, but largely forgettable. So with that being said, I think we could start just seeing, Dad, what you think when you started reading sci-fi at a pretty young age. I remember, what was it that grabbed you about that genre in particular?
Well, I think I started reading in earnest in order to imitate my forebears who would read the pulp science fiction magazines back in the 30s and the 40s. I had grown up in the space race in the 1960s, and I loved dinosaurs. So talking about the old days is like talking about the dinosaurs, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, and my dad would bring home various books from the library, and one that he brought home that he thought I would like was called the Early Asimov. And this was where Isaac Asimov, in somewhere in the early 70s, had collected a bunch of his early stories that were previously uncollected. And then interspersed with those stories were short introductions that described how he had come to science fiction. His father owned a candy store. They'd stock the pulp science fiction magazines, the other pulp magazines, and he was allowed to read them provided he left them untouched. And then he also described how he began as a writer. All of this at the age of 12 was really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And I discovered that at a candy store near me, there were some digest science fiction magazines. And at the time, I don't think I really understood the difference between an old fashioned pulp, which was much larger and pretty shoddy put together, and the digest magazines. But I picked up a copy of Worlds of If and kind of went from there, reading all the science fiction I could get my hands on and that my dad would let me read, because at 12, he did, he was of the opinion, correctly, that there were some things that really a 12-year-old doesn't need to read at that age in the science fiction world. But that's kind of where I got started in imitation of the guys who were devouring the pulp magazines back in the 30s.
Interesting. I like how even the candy store detail matched up with Asimov. That's a good start.
And yeah, the candy store isn't there anymore. And eventually I subscribed and discovered that small magazines don't have great subscription services. And sometimes you wouldn't get an issue. Sometimes you got 2 copies of an issue. But, and then I collected some, particularly the Worlds of If magazine. I happen to have a particularly liking for. So those would have been the oldest of the magazines that you would have found in the tubs in the basement.
Yeah, I think we have a bunch of fantasy and science fiction magazines down there, and then like 2 or 3 old analog magazine, and then a couple of Worlds of If. So I think that most of those old favorites of yours have probably been scattered to the 4 winds, but we still have a couple of them down there.
Oh, we still have at least 1 tub, and maybe a bit beyond that. But yeah, over the years, the importance of keeping all these magazines has diminished in competition with other priorities. I still have the whatever 30 or 40 worlds of if that I collected over the years. And some of those may have some value, but most of them are just, you put out a magazine once a month for years, and you're going to publish some good stuff and a lot of stuff that is best forgotten.
Yeah, I do think the title Worlds of If is probably the best sci-fi magazine title that I've come across, because that pretty much gets to the essence of what it is. You ask an if, and then you make a world based on that. Like, I think that's a very, it cuts right to the chase, I would say. And those, I think, in my memory, I feel like had some of the best and most captivating cover art as well.
Well, they often did. And of course, the reason for that is marketing, especially for anybody who's going to buy it on a newsstand. You've got to be able to grab their attention. So, yeah, they have a lot of good cover art, and that contributes to one of the things I was thinking about in terms of science fiction, especially for a young person, and that is what they call sense of wonder.
Yeah.
When you first start out reading science fiction, especially at 12, someone once said the golden age of science fiction is 12. And I don't remember who said that though. But you're first coming to these stories, which in many ways may be hackneyed and mediocre as far as science fiction and literature go. But you're coming to these fresh, and it opens up vistas of the imagination that you hadn't really known before. And that's where that sense of wonder comes from, that I think is a big hook for a lot of young people who begin reading that.
Yeah, that was my experience with I guess they're not quite like sci-fi, but they're in the same neighborhood. Books that were like those scholastic series, like what was it, Animorphs and Remnant. And even some of the Goosebumps books were like, they're, objectively they would be like pulp or garbage, but at the same time I remember those inspiring my imagination at about that age, 11 or 12. And really, I think really inspired me to kind of write my own stories that were along similar lines. And just the idea of like thinking in these strange worlds. And Animorphs did have some sci-fi themes where there's like an alien force that's slowly infiltrating Earth. And they're like little slugs that go in people's ears and then they can control their brain. So it had like sci-fi feel to it. And Choose Your Own Adventure. Ben, I don't know if you ever remember reading those, but books. That also had often sci-fi themes, but also a sci-fi element to it where you kind of chose the story as it unfolded and watched like the outcome of your individual choices and lived as the character. All those I remember inspiring my imagination, although they wouldn't pass any literary muster, I don't think, at this point.
Maybe.
You think so? You think Animorphs would hold up? I haven't gone back.
I thought maybe. At least that sort of thing. A lot of those endless young adult series are the sort of thing which, at least the idea and the world behind and just the overall story is actually kind of interesting, and in the hands of someone who was aiming to combine an interesting world with actual artistic skill, might be able to make something worthwhile of it. But
yeah,
not the Animorphs as we know them, I'd say.
Yeah. Realize that sometimes when it comes to young adult, maybe juvenile type stories, they don't necessarily, in the popular vein, they don't necessarily need to be literature or even all that original if they're coming to a reader for the first time. I think that's something I kind of realized when I go back and read something from the old days. And David, I think you remember we went to that bookstore in Los Angeles. Was it the Last Bookstore?
The Last Bookstore,
crazy place. And I found that collection of stories by a guy named Stephen Trull. And one of them contained a story that was in the first or second Worlds of If that I ever read. I think August 1973, maybe. And this was a story which I remember really lighting my imagination because it was told primarily from the standpoint of an alien being, a non-human being, a kind of a turtle-like thing living on a desert planet, and a human ship comes to visit. Now, and this really, I had remembered that over all the years, 50 years or whatever it was. And when I reread it, it wasn't bad, but I saw a lot of things that, were, I think, common themes in science fiction, things that, maybe a little clunky as far as storytelling goes. So, but at the time, as I said, it really captured my imagination. Reading it now, it's more a matter of nostalgia. Yeah, and so I recognize that if, that the fact that a young person is reading things that may not be high literature, may not be totally original, but if it serves the purpose of firing their imagination, I think that's okay. It's important to realize that that's a step that you go.
Sort of harkens back to the things we said about imagination in our education series, David.
Yeah, I think you kind of just need the raw material to start working with. And even if it's hackneyed on the adult level, all the stuff that an adult recognizes as hackneyed is something that like originally had appeal. And that's why it's part of the cliche and part of the structure of it. I think a lot of times in sci-fi, like you can see people adding like greater literary and character depth on top of the same structures, basically. I agree too. I think just even also just with the mechanics of reading and loving books, I would have to defend series like Animorphs and those Scholastic books, because I remember devouring those and really becoming adept at like getting through a story quick and getting to know the characters and then understanding what they would do and what they wouldn't do. And I think just by the process, the fact that you can whip through them so quickly does give you confidence as a reader and kind of just trains your imagination to grasp a story and then a world. So I certainly agree with that. Did you find that you were attracted more to the science elements of it, or was it the like you described, kind of a dramatic shift in perspective with seeing the world from an alien being? Was it the richness of the strange worlds that were created? Like, was there something in particular that grabbed you about them? Because I know that science these days especially has been greatly de-emphasized, and the genre is almost more considered speculative fiction, where it's more just about a question than any particular scientific concept. And I personally have found the hard science fiction, where it focuses really heavily on the scientific theory at work, to be usually pretty hard to read, because the characters, the author's talent tends to be much more in the realm of science than on storytelling.
Well, I think it depends, and I think certainly, I think in the early days of science fiction, there was a greater degree of technical things. There was, in fact, a whole series. This was before my time, but I read I started a retrospective collection of something called the Venus Equilateral series, which was a big thing back in the, I think, 30s and 40s in the magazines, which was basically a kind of a ham radio science fiction, imagining a communications relay satellite like in orbit around Venus or something, and them having to solve problems related to radio transmissions. Now that was about the hardest science fiction I think I ever encountered, and I think space stories would be the first answer to your question, because I kind of came at science fiction from the 1960s space race.
Okay.
I never was into really hard science fiction, but I kind of think that the idea of that is more stereotype than real. I always did like the kind of puzzle stories. And I always kind of liked revelations that were logical unfoldings of a story, something that Larry Niven, in a lot of the stories he did in the 60s and 70s, you'd find there'd be some basic idea, you'd be going along, and all of a sudden he would reveal a new location, something that you hadn't thought of yourself. And that was always kind of cool. I was later to the fantasy that was, and really in the 70s, there wasn't that much of it other than Lord of the Rings. And I guess the Wizard of Earthsea still existed at the time, but the things, and then one of the big revolutions that came along was Star Wars.
Yeah.
And that kind of changed how people even thought about science fiction. But one thing I kind of wanted to talk about, because it occurred to me, I used to read a lot of science fiction when I was young. I only read, nowadays in the course of a year, I maybe read one or two old things, and then I'll read maybe one or two new books. This is in the course of reading 20 or 30 books in a year. And I kind of think that, and what your thoughts on this, that if the golden age of science fiction is 12, is there a point at which you outgrow that imaginative formation, and science fiction is just one of a number of interesting, profitable genres that you can read? I mean, do either of you feel compelled to pick up a lot of science fiction these days, as sort of grown-ups, as it were?
Yeah, what do you think, Ben?
I do. I muted myself. Mom came in for a second. It's definitely a family affair today. I still find myself drawn to science fiction. I think largely because when I was in grad school, I wanted to read anything that wasn't nonfiction. So I did a lot of reading of all sorts of stuff, whether it was serious fiction, like Faulkner or Joseph Conrad or something. But now that I've had more time, now that I'm done with grad school and I've had more time to just read stuff on my own, I find myself kind of periodically coming back around to science fiction, just because I don't think there's sort of the initial imaginative formation that you have. But it seems like the imagination is not unlike, it's not unlike your body, which needs you need that initial formation in order to not become, you need to learn how to walk and all that sort of thing, but you also need to keep feeding your body. Otherwise you'll die. It seems like the imagination is similar to that, where if you only treat childhood is the time of the imagination, and then you kind of grow up to bigger adult things, it seems like it's not a good thing for one's imagination to be inflexible or fragile, as opposed to being imaginatively anti-fragile. It seems like you need to constantly be feeding your imagination. And I kind of go on different cycles of whether it's fantasy, and then I'm like, okay, I'm tired of fantasy. Then I'll go to more serious literature. Then I get tired of that because then I'll wind up going back to sci-fi. So I don't know if I'm ever drawn to sci-fi exclusively for any longer than the other kinds of literature or fiction that I read. But I know that sci-fi definitely has a certain place in that cycle of in my imagination diet. It's definitely has a prominent place in the menu, for different reasons than fantasy or science fiction or straight up literature. But I still do find myself turning to it actively for that sort of imagination enriching experience that it offers.
Yeah, I think I do have to agree that I do think that the golden age of science fiction is when you're about 12, and for the few years after that. Because on my own experience, I did lose the appetite for it after that. And there's a bit of a Puff the Magic Dragon feeling about it to me, where, in that song, Jackie Paper becomes concerned with other things as he grows up, more proximate elements of growing up, and that imaginary world just kind of becomes a place that he's not really living in anymore. And so I do think I felt like a natural progression out of it, as perhaps the imaginary world had to take necessarily more of a back seat to more approximate practical concerns. But I do find myself, whenever I encounter science fiction and pick it up, even in recent years, I do find it to be enjoyable. I mean, we all, always sing the praises of Ted Chiang. I've liked pretty much every story I've read by him. And I do find that I like ones that are really, other than him, ones that are more character driven, and where the speculative themes are just kind of the setting, but it's more about character or social issues. Like I've brought up before, the Beggars in Spain by Nancy Kress, where the plot is if you could genetically engineer people who didn't have to sleep, and what would be the social consequences of that. Or what's the other one I was thinking? Or the other story I mentioned in another episode, The Persistence of Vision, which I haven't revisited that, so I don't know if it's good, but also more of a social character related question, like change one thing about the way people relate to each other, and how does that affect, everybody's interior and social, and like the social structure. So I feel like I am still attracted to speculative fiction, but the vistas of space and, kind of space opera type settings don't hold the appeal that they once did to me. And I don't know if that's just becoming more concerned with, the concrete world, or like your own interior development of character, rather than, wonder at the external world. And I don't know if it's a good thing either, but I do definitely relate to kind of leaving that behind and not having nearly as much of an appetite for it. But it's, and when I do have an appetite, it's more for character, the character development or social side of speculative science, speculative fiction.
Mm.
But I don't know if that's,
yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ben.
No, that was David starting.
Oh,
go ahead.
All right. I was just thinking, as you were talking about some of the things I'm planning or hoping to get a chance to read in the coming year, in addition to the 5,000 page Civil War trilogy that you got me for Christmas. On the one hand, there's more, I guess you'd call it harder science fiction, really hard science fiction, in the case of Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian a few years back. He's got a book out, I think it's called The Hail Mary. I'm waiting on that from the library, and I'm hoping to read a new Neil Stephenson novel, which I think is basically about climate change. But then I was also thinking that on the other hand, one area of science fiction that I did not explore at all when I was in my callow youth, as it were, is science fiction by women writers. I kind of avoided that when I was younger and reading a lot of science fiction. And Ben got me to read the Wizard of Earthsea trilogy earlier this year by Ursula K. Le Guin. And then I also read the fourth book in that, Tahanu, which I think was sort of the beginning of her exploring a more feminist dimension in her fantasy world. I actually thought it was really good. It was very different than the trilogy, the original trilogy, but I thought it made a lot of sense in its world. So I'm hoping to read maybe some more Le Guin, some maybe Joanna Russ. And then I was also thinking Philip K. Dick is an entirely different kind of writer, more a 1960s writer, but has his own little subcult following, I think, in many ways. Maybe read some of his stuff, but we'll see how much of that I can get through while refighting the Civil War.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting to say about the women writers. I feel like that made me think a lot of the authors that I've really enjoyed and gone back to repeatedly in science fiction are women, because I mentioned Nancy Kress, and I've read a lot of her short fiction, and hers is not really in any way, doesn't really have any feminist tones really. And a lot of it tends to be kind of in that slightly hard edge cyberpunk type of, at least the feel of the story. but I've always found her short fiction and that novel to be really thought provoking. And I always really like Connie Willis and Nancy Etchemendy, who you're also a fan of. I feel like those authors I've returned to quite a bit. And I think especially in that 70s era, I noticed it when I revisited last year. I listened to it on audiobook, Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, which was like sci-fi enters the 70s. And it was a lot of elements I thought were pretty good. And just accepting the fact that it's a 70s
60s,
work.
That's a 60s book.
Or 60s work. Yeah. On the cusp of that awakening, and it was like sci-fi enters it. Some elements of it I thought were really good, some were cringy. But I noticed there, and I've noticed it in a lot of that older science fiction from that era, that there is like an almost painfully masculine perspective on things, which now really doesn't age well. And some of it's like just awkward, and some of it's more just like oof, like that really needed to take into account a less masculine perspective. And that book was especially, I noticed it especially where it was like, it's clear that kind of the brilliant professor genius character is essentially Heinlein's avatar of himself in the story. And kind of with all that entails. And I noticed that, I remember that also being, I probably notice it more now, but remember that being the case in The Persistence of Vision, where it's very clear that the protagonist like is the author, and it's his view of the world. But I think at this point, that's probably been pretty much done a full 180. I would imagine that the female perspective is probably the dominant in current science fiction, which I'm not that familiar with, but it's interesting. I do think that perhaps that the feminine perspective in a male-dominated genre could potentially be even better at that speculative side of things, because it's offering yet another different perspective on these kinds of changes.
Well, I think it's to kind of go meta for a little bit. A lot of people go to science fiction and begin going to science fiction for that different perspective. And in many ways, it's a safe perspective, because you could read a book about the African American experience, or even an African experience, or Hispanic experience, or so on. In a way, those are not as comfortable as reading the perspective of a Martian or something. So, but another thing that I think has come, and you kind of mentioned this, David, in talking about things that are cringy and clearly male-dominated viewpoint. You can read older science fiction, probably true of older popular fiction generally, not just science fiction. And in a way, you can then triangulate on what the cultural foundation was, or viewpoint was back then. Because you can certainly read things from the 50s or the 40s and say, or the 30s. I know Isaac Asimov, in another collection he did called Before the Golden Age, expressed, because that was a collection of stories from the 1930s, old things that he loved when he was just a reader. And he pointed out a number of places where there was that kind of white male, European, Western supremacy type thing, where the natives were, inferior. And he didn't have a lot of stories like that. And it was his own theory that those began to fade a bit as people became aware of Hitler's excesses in Germany with regard to minorities. But I think reading popular works from earlier times can help get a sense of your own differences from the past culture. So in that sense, science fiction in a meta kind of way helps And you even those of us who are not ardently woke can look back and say, ooh, yeah, I just reread The Ringworld, the novel Ringworld by Larry Niven. Because I had been thinking for some reason about the structure of the Ringworld. So I reread it, and it's an interesting concept, but I was struck by the fact that the main female character in that book, Tila Brown, is sort of by the author's design, has no agency of her own, which, not at the time, it certainly didn't strike me when I was whatever, 12 or 13 when I read it. But looking back on it, ooh, that doesn't feel right now. That's a cultural difference that I think, and that you also experienced in reading Stranger in a Strange Land, which has got to be a very culturally marked book. That was a very popular countercultural book in the early 60s.
It's extremely so. And I guess actually what it sort of is, what's I think cringy about it is that it's pretty much a hyper white masculine, in one sense, like a hyper masculine perspective on the dawn of feminism, where basically that sort of the Heinlein avatar character is essentially excited about feminism by being like, oh, like the path to liberation is for young, attractive women to have sex with older guys. And that seems like, and he's like, wow, this is great, and that's like a big key part of the story is the free love element, of which this character is a beneficiary among many others. And that's, I think the cringy part is like, God, that is so hot, so self-serving on a perspective on that development. And
true, although I gotta say, I mean, granted, that part of Heinlein is quite weird and cringy. There were a lot of elements in Heinlein's stories that did kind of emphasize the competence of women, and in a very embryonic way, I think planted the seeds of my own, what I hope is a regard for the equality of women. I don't think you can go back and find that in Heinlein the way he may have thought it was there. But I think that as a starting point for someone reading those when they're young, that may open up for them the idea that this is, women are in fact the equals, and in some cases the superiors of men. That book is not really illustrative of it, though.
Yeah, I'm picking on just that one work. I mean, he has an enormous bibliography, but that's the one I revisited recently. And I thought overall it was good, and it has a lot of what's awesome about sci-fi in it. But there are some hilariously out of place elements in it when you look at it from today's perspective. But Ben, what were you going to say?
I was going to say C.J. Cherryh, who is another woman sci-fi writer. She very frequently, she's almost like Tolkien in how much density she gives her fictional worlds, and frequently every world she creates, one of the common factors is it's always a matriarchal society that she's creating, no matter which book you're reading. Chanur, the Chanur novels, the Fated Sun trilogy, Foreigner, I'm trying to think of some others. I mean, quite either it's a matriarchal society, or if it's not, she always has broken male characters who need the assistance of very strong female characters. That's a theme in Down Below Station, in the Citeen books, also in the Chinner books, at least the first one. So I guess she's writing in the late 70s, early 80s. So this is after that fact, but it was treated early on. I would be leery of.
She wrote, mid 70s and onward.
I don't know, but I'm leery of only reading anything by someone simply because of their identity perspective that they might be able to bring to it, because it seems like what characterizes science fiction is less the personal identity or sort of the background identity of the author, and more how well they're able to ask and answer a what if question. And if in the way they answer the question is going to obviously be imbued with certain of their culturally inherited or just weird characteristics. But I think that it's important to know how to interpret those within the context of the story. Because if you think of someone like Gene Wolfe, and not everybody is consciously trying to write unreliable narrators, but I think that, in the case of Gene Wolfe, like he has often been read as being a woman hater, but he's always writing from the perspective of unreliable male narrators. And if that's the case, you can either read that on the surface and say, oh, this is just like trashy male softcore porn, but you're like, well, not necessarily. It's actually, if he's self-consciously writing an unreliable male narrator, and in that context, you're always getting a somewhat objectified depiction of women, then he's actually presenting quite a social commentary on the masculine mind, that the habit of seeing women in that fashion is a feature that all of his characters they're very infrequently are they heroic or like likable protagonists, but you don't necessarily realize that till further along in the story. So it seems like there's potentially more dimension in the weird qualities of some of that early science fiction and otherwise, than just that, oh, they have some weird ideas and isn't that strange and cringy. It seems like if you really respect them as artists, you want to try to see, okay, why could that possibly be serving the story